So this is the plant that I just recently got from a nursery called Four Winds Growers. It's online, it's California nursery. They have a really large assortment of avocado plants, and I believe Summer Winds and all your local nurseries actually buy from that nursery wholesale, and then obviously up pot them because they come in these little grower pots, you know, put them into like a 5-gallon and then charge you probably double the price of what they paid. It's kind of their business model. See, it's in one of those tree pots, so nice and deep for that taproot to go. So here's the graft point, fairly recently grafted, you know, green skin, but nice healthy plant. It's about 2 feet tall. So this is what I'm going to be planting today, and I'm going to be planting on a mound. So I'm going to take you through that process. So when going to plant any tree, it's really important to know what kind of soil you have. Out here in the Phoenix, Arizona area, my yard is composed of mostly heavy clay soil. So the challenge with clay soil is the particles are so small that there aren't really any gaps in between those particles to allow for oxygenation. And plant roots, tree roots, need that in order to have a healthy root system. Just like you and I need to breathe, plants do as well. And so without that, they are going to slowly die in the soil. So the problem with clay is it's not permeable. When it gets wet, the water tends to just sit in it like a bowl. And so the plant roots never have a chance to actually drain through, and they're just sitting in that condition. If you're anything like me, there might be spots in your yard where you have a low spot and water just does not seem to drain through well. It might even get a bluish tint to that. That's indicative of those anaerobic conditions. So if there's any tree that does not like that kind of situation, it's an avocado tree. It needs 3 times the amount of air in the soil as other fruit trees. Now that we talked about my soil, what am I going to do about that so that this avocado tree has the best chance? Well, I'm going to plant it on a mound. I have been doing that as a practice for all my fruit trees in the last couple years, and find that they grow so much better if you plant them on a slight mound than to plant them, you know, at soil grade. Number one, plants have a tendency to sink over time, and you don't want your roots to be, you know, down low, below soil grade. The other aspect that's good about a mound is that it allows you to put in amended soil around that immediate root ball. That ensures that when this gets irrigated or when it rains, that those roots can drain through. So on choosing how large to make your mound, it's really going to be predicated on the plant you're putting in. So you can see this plant here is coming up just around the height of this retaining wall block. And that's perfect. Because what I want to do is essentially sit the root ball of that plant directly on the bottom of the native soil. And then fill in amended soil all the way around it. What I'll be using for the amended soil is what I typically will use for my container mix. And that's going to be equal parts of peat moss, decomposed granite or sand, and also perlite or volcanic rock. In an ideal soil profile, there's a lot of sand. That allows drainage. So what we want to do with our amended soil is bring that component in. It's lacking in my native soil profile, so I want to bring it in to allow that great drainage. So I've got 2 products here. These are both what I find at my local Lowe's, but this is all-purpose sand. That's a good one to get. These are located in your garden center. Typically, this is just a half cubic foot bag here. I think they run around $5, maybe $6 at this point. Prices keep going up. The other component here I have is decomposed granite. So what's the difference between these two? So with all-purpose sand, you know, it's going to be fairly soft. It's what, you know, they use in kids' sandboxes and things. It doesn't really have any structural integrity to it, but it is going to allow really great drainage. This is what I typically will use in a container planting. What I tend to like to use for in-ground plantings is decomposed granite. This also has sand in it, but it also has some tiny aggregate. Okay, so it's a little bit grittier, a little bit rougher. So the reason I like this for an in-ground planting is I want a little bit more structure. I want the soil to hold its form a bit more than with sand. You can use either one, that's just my preference, and kind of the key difference between decomposed granite and all-purpose sand. So what I'm going to do with this planting is for my third part of sand, I'm going to do kind of a half and half between decomposed granite and sand. I could go fully decomposed granite. In fact, you could amend completely with decomposed granite. There are some gardeners out there that advocate for that. An avocado tree will grow into straight decomposed granite. I personally think that's a little bit too much, but there are people that advocate for that. The other component we're using is peat moss. Okay, this is just Sphagum peat moss. Again, you can get a bag of this 3 cubic foot bag at your big box store. And you can see with this mixture, it's very light, very fluffy, kind of the opposite of clay. So peat moss has a few benefits going for it. It is slightly acidic, which, because we have clay soil, you know, our pH tends to be quite alkaline. So this will bring down the pH a bit right around the root ball, which is a good thing for an avocado plant and pretty much any kind of fruit tree that you're growing. This material also, while it is organic, it's not going to break down very fast. It's going to take many, many years for this to begin to shrink. Unlike potting soil that's going to shrink up, you know, within a year as the stuff breaks down. This also is not going to rot. You know, it doesn't include these organic components that are going to break down and start rotting and decaying right around the roots. Which, like I mentioned with avocado plants, they're very prone to root rot, so you do not want organic materials right within contact of the roots. You definitely want to pile up a lot of organic matter on top of the plant, but not in the planting hole. To balance out the weight of the sand, I like to use volcanic rock. This again is going to create air gaps. And like I mentioned, avocado plants need a lot of oxygenation in the soil around them. And here's what this looks like. So the grain on this is fairly fine. I do not like using the stuff in containers because of that. It's very lightweight and has a tendency to float out of the container. So I don't mind using this with in-ground plantings because it's not going to go anywhere. It doesn't really have a chance of, you know, floating out. For container plantings, I'll tend to use another type of volcanic rock called pumice. I've also used lava rock. If you can find it in small enough pieces, that should work. So different options here for that. Another thing we're going to use today is some gypsum. Okay, this doesn't work overnight, but definitely does help with the clay, breaking it up, changing the soil composition, making it more permeable to water. So what we're going to do with this is just dump it at the bottom of my mound so that it can work over time to help loosen that soil so that taproot can then penetrate through. So another benefit of this, specific to avocados, is it has calcium and sulfur that it provides to the plant. That sulfur, of course, is going to help with the pH to lower it, and the calcium is actually going to help prevent rot, the root rot problem, that microorganism from affecting the roots. So a lot of farmers in California, avocado farmers, will apply gypsum 15 pounds, you know, every year to each plant for the health of that plant. I am going to inoculate the soil with some mycorrhiza. This is just good because you're working with inert material, even though there is definitely a mycelium web down there in the native soil. It's not going to be present in, you know, the sand and the peat moss that we looked at and the volcanic rock. So we need to inoculate that to kind of get that process going. So I like to just use that on the root ball when I'm planting on a mound. And finally, I am going to put a little bit of clay soil in. This is native clay from another area of my yard that hasn't seen irrigation in a long time, so it's pretty dry. But just to have the roots start to get slightly used to the clay, we're going to add a little bit of that to the amended mix. It's it's not going to count for much, probably only about 15%. So on sizing of the mound, it's all preference and depends on how big you're going to keep your tree and how much space you have. So an avocado farmer, I hear, tend to have their mounds about 3 feet high and as much as 10 feet across, which is a pretty sizable mound. I'm not planning on maintaining an orchard-sized tree. This is in backyard culture, and plus I don't have the space for that. Okay, I have a tree nearby here, sapodilla. I have a persimmon right here next door. So because I needed the mound to be a little bit more compact, I use retaining wall block so that this mound will not collapse because it's going to be fairly tight. So here we said it's about a foot off the ground. These blocks, I guess, are around 6 inches tall. So we're about 2 feet on the width. So this isn't a very large mound, but it's going to serve my purpose. The retaining material that I used block just because I happen to have that in the yard to repurpose for this. You don't have to use something this heavy duty. You could use edging material. So as you've probably seen in a lot of my other videos, that's what I used for the mangoes. So when I first planted these mangoes, they were not as big as this avocado we're going to plant today. They were only 4 inches high, the root ball. So I just used plastic edger. Okay, this is just edger that you can get in rolls, and then I just cut it to the length I wanted, drilled some holes in either end, and then used wire to close that around. And so you can see the example here on this lemon meringue mango. That edger is just sitting on the ground. And I use that just so that the mound stays together. Because what's going to happen is if you don't have edger material or something to retain your mound, and it's narrow like this, it's going to collapse over time. It's going to erode. With irrigation, with rain, with wind, with pets in your backyard, digging around. Here's another example. This is some metal edger that I got, galvanized aluminum. And it's a little taller, it's 12 inches. So it just depends on the root ball, and your preference on material. So my first step is to put some gypsum in to the bottom of this hole. I know I used maybe a pound there. I'm just going to break up the soil a bit. The soil is actually not too bad in this spot because I have had wood chips here for years. So the topsoil is pretty good. But once you get about 8 inches down, that's when you start hitting more of the clay. So that just provides something for the plant to root into. From there, I'm going to just start mixing up my components. So I'm going to start with the clay. Put a little bit of that in. There I've got the decomposed granite. Put in about an equal amount of that. Alright, now I've got my peat moss. So get that in there. Around equal proportion of that. And then we got our perlite, or volcanic rock. So I'm basically doing an equal proportion in volume of each of those 4 components. And this is just what's worked for me. Pretty basic, easy to remember. You can play with the ratios and do what suits you best. And we do another round. here I have some prepared mix of already my peat moss and perlite, and then sand this time around. This is what I was using for potting blueberries. So a very similar mixture. Alright, so I'm just going to cut the green tape off that the nursery put on here so I can slip this stake out. I'm going to slip this out of the pot. To get it out, I'm just pushing down on the bottom here to free it. Here you can see the roots. So pretty well rooted plant. So just going to add some mycorrhiza, just about a teaspoon. Okay, and then I'm just seeding this so I can get all the soil around it at the same level. Our Mexicola Grande is all planted up, looking good. We can see here that we had just enough soil to basically bring the soil level up to the last of the roots at the top here. Seed is exposed, which you want to do. You don't want to bury that. And then the last step is just to mulch this guy. Fortunately, I have a lot of mulch in the yard because I have bamboo. Bamboo leaves are a great mulch for any of your plants, including avocado. They have silicate in there, so that just helps strengthen the plant, which is why I left a little bit of space here on the sides to contain that mulch. And I may even bring it up higher with maybe some chicken wire around the perimeter of this barrier so that I can stack up, another 8 inches or so of mulch. But we're essentially just filling this all the way up. We'll just get the rest of this in here. Because it's got really good draining soil at this point, light and frequent applications of water is what I would be doing with this plant for the rest of the fall season. It does not need deep watering. Thanks for joining me on this planting. Hope this was helpful and answered some of your questions about planting on a mound and why that's helpful, especially with the tree like an avocado. If you do have questions, please post them below. Thanks for watching and happy gardening.